The choir boy never came home in 1993. In 2023, a confession tape was mailed to his sister. You don't expect the dead to come back through the mail. Not after 30 years. Not on a Thursday morning in December, when all you're doing is sweeping pine needles off the porch. But that's how it started. Not with a bang, not with a scream, just a soft thump in the mailbox and an envelope that didn't belong. It was padded, yellowed, no return address. Just my name, Claire Morgan, typed in all caps like someone was trying to shout in silence. I remember standing there longer than I should have, the wind lifting my hair, the sound of distant church bells clanging noon even though it was barely past 10. The envelope felt oddly warm, or maybe my hands were cold. I didn't open it right away. I just stared at it, heart tapping against my ribs like a warning. Something about it felt too familiar, like I had held it before, in another life, or maybe in a dream I'd spent 3 decades trying to forget. I walked inside, placed it on the counter next to my half-drunk coffee, and made myself finish sweeping the porch, like finishing that chore could somehow delay whatever was already on its way. But the second I came back inside, I couldn't help it. I tore the flap open. Inside was a single cassette tape, black, unlabeled, and a square of paper, old and curling at the edges like it had been folded too many times. On it, in shaky handwriting, "It's time. Forgive me." That was it. No name, no explanation, just that. And suddenly, I was 16 again, standing in the hallway of St. Jude's, holding Caleb's choir robe in one hand and his empty backpack in the other, wondering how a person just disappears between the closing hymn and the parking lot. Caleb had been 13 when he vanished. Sweet, quiet, always humming. He loved music more than most kids love candy. The kind of boy who wrote down harmonies in the margins of his schoolwork. That night, October 18th, 1993, he stayed late for choir practice. Said he wanted to rehearse his solo one more time before the Sunday service. He never came home. They found his jacket draped neatly over the back pew, his music folder tucked into his bag, but no signs of struggle, no noise, no witnesses, just absence, raw and immediate, like a hole torn through the world. The police searched for weeks. Divers scoured the lake. Flyers went up on every telephone pole from here to Augusta, but nothing came. No ransom, no message, no body, just speculation, and then silence. People said maybe he ran away, maybe he'd been taken, maybe, maybe. But none of those maybes brought my brother back, and none of them could explain what a choir boy would be running from when the only thing he ever wanted was to sing. My parents unraveled in slow motion. Mom stopped singing in church. Dad started drinking in the garage. They barely spoke to each other after the first year. By the second year, I think they forgot how. I did what I thought I was supposed to. Got good grades, smiled when asked, moved away for college. And for years, I kept pretending the past was buried under time, that it would stay that way. But the truth has teeth, and memory is a lock you can't unpick until something turns the key. That cassette felt like a key. The Walkman was still in a box in the attic. I'd kept it only because it had Caleb's sticker on the side, a faded cartoon treble clef with googly eyes he'd stuck there after his first solo. It barely worked now, but when I slid the tape in and pressed play, the machine clicked like an old throat clearing itself before confession. The first sound was static, thick, crackling, then breathing, long, uneven, male. A voice, low and shaky, filtered through. If you're hearing this, it means I didn't burn it, like I said I would. It means I couldn't die with it inside me. I stopped breathing. My name? Well, it doesn't matter. You'll know soon enough. Back then, they called me Brother Thomas. I was supposed to be a man of God, but I broke that. I broke everything. I stood frozen in my kitchen, heart hammering. The voice went on, each word like a stone dropped into dark water. October 18th, 1993. The boy was there late. He wasn't supposed to be. Said he wanted to practice. I told him to go home. But he stayed, and There was a long pause, then a dry, shaky inhale. I lost control. He said something. I don't even remember what, but I raised my hand. I didn't mean to hit him that hard. I didn't mean to. He didn't say the word. Didn't need to. He didn't move after that. I checked. I panicked. I called Matthias. He said the church couldn't survive a scandal. Said if it got out, we'd be destroyed. So we carried him. We hid him behind the old choir wall. It was being renovated. Nobody noticed. We sealed it. We prayed. Then we forgot. I dropped the Walkman. Let it clatter to the floor, tape still hissing softly. My knees gave out, and I sank to the kitchen tile like gravity had finally remembered me. Caleb hadn't disappeared. He had been taken, silenced, entombed, not by a stranger, not by fate, but by men in robes who had sung hymns over his hidden grave. I sat there for I don't know how long. The light in the window shifted. The birds outside kept chirping, like the world hadn't just shifted off its axis. Then I stood up. I picked up the Walkman, and I rewound the tape. Because sometimes you only get one chance to hear the truth. And when it finally comes, no matter how much it hurts, you listen, you listen, you listen because the dead don't come back. But sometimes they call. The second time I played the tape, I closed every curtain in the house and locked the front door. Not because I was afraid someone would hear, but because something in me felt like this wasn't meant for the world, like what I was about to hear belonged to the darkness, and maybe to God. I sat cross-legged on the floor with the Walkman in my lap and my palms braced flat against the hardwood, like I was grounding myself against what came next. The voice resumed, mid-sentence, as if it had never left. We said prayers. We lit candles. We fasted. But nothing we did made it right. I told myself it was penance. That silence was the cost of redemption. His voice cracked. But the truth is, silence is not penance. Silence is cowardice dressed up like reverence. And I have been a coward for 30 years. My mouth was dry. I didn't blink. I barely breathed. I wanted to confess, he said, years ago. But Matthias, he was the priest then. He said it would ruin everything. Said we'd both be excommunicated. Said the parish would collapse. Said the boy's family would suffer more if the truth came out. I laughed. Short, bitter. Suffer more? We were children who lived in a ghost house. My mother never touched the piano again. My father drank his voice into silence, And I had to grow up in a town that stared at me like I was the leftover half of a tragedy they didn't want to name. He went on. I see his face in my sleep, every night. Sometimes I wake up with the sound of his voice in my ears. That pure, high note. I hear it crack, and then stop. He paused. A long silence. I thought the tape had ended. Then, more quietly. He didn't cry. He looked at me, and it was like he understood, like he knew what would happen. He didn't fight. I pressed pause. My hands were trembling again, and the air in the room felt thick, like I was underwater. Caleb didn't fight. He just accepted it. I couldn't breathe. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, didn't drink it, just held it like an anchor. My thoughts were spinning in slow, nauseating circles. The confession was real, or at least it felt real. Too specific to be a prank, too guilty to be fiction. But why now? Why send it to me? And who mailed it if Brother Thomas had already died? I knew I had to go back. Back to St. Jude. Back to the place I swore I'd never set foot in again. But first, I needed proof. Something to hold in my hand if anyone dared call me delusional. I started digging. That afternoon, I pulled every old box out of the attic. Photo albums, school papers, church bulletins, Caleb's old sheet music, still in his handwriting. I found one flyer from the original search effort, October 21st, 1993. His school photo printed grainy and slightly off-center. The words, "Have you seen this boy?" burned into my chest like fresh ink. I flipped it over. On the back, my father had scrawled something I'd never noticed before. A list. Last seen, 7:46 p.m. Weather, light rain. Jacket, navy blue. Voice part, soprano. Reported missing, 9:22 p.m. It was like he'd been trying to hold on to every detail, every minute, as if, by recording the facts, he could reverse them. But facts hadn't brought Caleb home. And now, 30 years later, a cassette tape from the grave had done more than any detective. I needed to verify the name. Brother Thomas, I whispered out loud, tasting it. There had been a monk by that name. I remembered the adults whispering it when I was younger. He wasn't a priest, but he worked at the parish. Custodian, groundskeeper, maybe something more. He disappeared from town around the same time Caleb did, but no one talked about it. They never said he was fired, never said he died, just gone. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, searched Brother Thomas St. Jude Parish 1993. Nothing, no records, no obituary. But in an archived church newsletter from November 93, I found a mention in the volunteer section. Thank you to Brother Thomas K. for his years of quiet service. No surname, no photo, just that single line, like a ghost folded into print. Then I found a death notice from a monastery hospice 2 towns away, dated November 23rd, 2023. Thomas Kennelly, age 78, died peacefully. No mention of St. Jude, no family listed, but the dates lined up. He had died 3 weeks before the tape arrived. I leaned back in my chair, stomach tight. Someone had sent it for him. Maybe at his request, maybe not. But whoever it was, they wanted me to hear it, and maybe they knew I'd do something about it. I picked up my phone, dialed the church. The voice on the other end was young, early 20s maybe. Definitely not someone who'd been there in 93. Hi, this is St. Jude's Parish. How can I help you? I swallowed. Yes. Hi, I'd like to speak with whoever oversees the choir room or the historical records. I'm researching a memorial for a former choir member, Caleb Morgan. There was a pause. I could almost hear him typing. I'm not seeing that name, he said finally. Was he from a long time ago? Yes, I said, more quietly. He sang here in 1993. Another pause. A little longer this time. I'll leave a note for Father Brandt, the boy said. He's only been here a year, but he's pretty good with the old files. Do you want to come in? I hesitated, then nodded, as if he could see me. Yes, I said, tomorrow, first thing. After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, holding the Walkman in my lap again, like it might answer the questions swirling in my head. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the outline of that back wall behind the choir loft. I heard Caleb's voice on replay, not real, just imagined, stitched from memory and grief. He was there. He'd always been there. And in the morning, I would be too. Because you can only bury a boy in silence for so long before the walls start to crack. I arrived at St. Jude's 15 minutes early, but the parking lot was already empty. The air still heavy with the kind of December fog that clings to your skin, like breath that won't leave. The church stood exactly as I remembered it. Stone walls the color of old bone, arched windows too narrow for daylight to enter completely, and a steeple that had always looked more like a warning than a welcome. The heavy front doors groaned the same way they used to when I was a teenager, slipping in late to hear Caleb rehearse. The same scent met me, too, beeswax polish, old paper, and something faintly metallic, like forgotten brass. For a moment, I stood there in the narthex, just listening. The silence inside churches isn't really silence. It breathes. It remembers. A young man, barely more than a boy, peeked out from a side office, startled to see someone that early. His name tag read Eli, probably the voice from the phone. You must be Claire, he said gently, his eyes flicking to the folder I clutched like a weapon. Father Brandt's running late, but I can show you the choir area if you'd like. I nodded. We walked side by side down the aisle. The pews looked smaller now. The altar looked higher. The organ in the back was still missing a few keys. Caleb used to joke about it during practice, making up funny phrases for each broken note. When we reached the back of the church, Eli unlocked a side gate and led me up a narrow staircase that curved tightly toward the loft. My fingers brushed the railing as we climbed. It was smooth with age, lacquered not by polish, but by the passage of time and hands that once belonged to people who thought this place was sacred. The choir loft hadn't changed. Same wooden risers, same dusty hymnals on the side shelf, same view overlooking the sanctuary below. But behind it, behind the risers and the velvet curtain, stood the wall. To anyone else, it was just that, a wall. Plain, dull. Wooden planks, some cracked, some stained. But I saw it differently. I saw it like Caleb had once leaned there, maybe even fallen there, maybe been laid to rest there. I asked Eli to give me a few moments alone. He hesitated, but eventually stepped out with the kind of reluctant compassion that only the very young can offer, sympathy without understanding. And then it was just me and the wall. I stepped closer, ran my fingers along the planks. Most were hard and aged, like they hadn't been touched in decades. But one section, left of center, shoulder height, looked different. The grain was smoother, the nails newer, the stain slightly darker. I tapped. It sounded hollow. My breath caught. I knocked again, gently, rhythmically. Hollow, hollow, solid, a rectangular echo, maybe 3 feet wide, 5 feet high. The size of a small boy curled in fear. My stomach turned. I pulled out my phone, hit record, and whispered, "He's here, behind this wall." When I turned around, Father Brant was already at the top of the stairs. I hadn't heard him come up. He was older than I expected, mid-60s, with a soft face and tired posture that reminded me more of a librarian than a man of the cloth. "You must be Ms. Morgan," he said, his voice low but kind. "I'm sorry for the delay. Eli said you're researching someone." "My brother," I said. "Caleb. He was part of the choir here in the early 90s. Disappeared after practice in 1993. You wouldn't know him." He looked at me, something shifting behind his eyes. Not recognition, but a kind of guarded alertness. "I've heard the name," he said carefully, "before my time. But we have some archives." "I don't need archives," I said, stepping aside. "I need you to look at this wall." He blinked. "This wall?" I nodded. "Someone sealed something here. Or someone." He hesitated, then stepped forward. He pressed his hand against the panel I'd indicated, knocked once, heard the same hollow echo. "You think—" "I have a tape," I interrupted. "A confession from someone who worked here. Said he accidentally killed Caleb. Said they hit him right here." Brant paled. "I'll call the diocese," he whispered. "No," I said firmly. "You'll call the police." There was a pause, a long one. Then he nodded. The next hours moved like molasses. I gave a statement. The police brought in forensic teams. They cordoned off the area, put up temporary lights, and within a few hours, a team of 2 began the delicate process of removing the central plank. The first thing they found was fabric, faded navy blue. A small choir robe stained by time and rot. Then bones, small, fragile, arranged unnaturally, like they had been folded to fit a space not meant for a body. And then, around the neck, still resting against the collarbone, was a silver chain. I didn't need to see the charm to know what was hanging from it. But I looked anyway. A tiny treble clef, Caleb's. I didn't cry. Not then. Not in front of the officers. Not in front of the priest. Not in front of God. I stood very still, the way I used to in church, when I wasn't sure what to believe, but was too afraid not to stand. The official word came later. Human remains consistent with a teenage male. Approximate time of death matches 1993. They'd send it to forensics, run DNA, open a formal case. They'd treat it like new. But nothing about this was new. The truth had just been waiting. Trapped behind a choir wall. Kept company by dust, silence, and the absence of music. Later that night, I returned home and sat on the porch with the tape in my hands, playing the last 30 seconds again and again. "I'm sorry," the voice said. "I don't expect peace, but maybe the truth will find a place to rest." I whispered aloud, "It will." Because maybe justice doesn't always start in a courtroom. Sometimes it starts with a sister who never stopped listening. And sometimes a wall can hold a lie for 30 years until someone dares to knock hard enough. I thought finding Caleb would bring stillness, closure, like those stories where someone finally unearths the truth and everything inside them settles like dust after a storm. But real life doesn't end in a single moment of discovery. It lingers, and the days after they pulled his bones from the wall were some of the heaviest I've ever known. The town moved slowly, like it was trying not to wake its own conscience. St. Jude's made a statement, brief, polished, and hollow. They offered prayers, condolences, and a promise to cooperate fully. But no apology, no names, just a familiar kind of silence dressed in solemnity. The local news picked it up. Cold case break. Remains believed to be choir boy missing since '93, found behind church wall. The story made it sound like a mystery had solved itself. No mention of the tape. No mention of Brother Thomas. Certainly no mention of the priest, Matthias, who had helped hide Caleb's body and then continued to preach over his grave for years. And in the grocery store, people who had once hugged my mother after Sunday Mass looked away when they saw me. Like truth was contagious. Like my face was a reminder of something they'd all agreed not to talk about. Some asked if I was angry. Angry? I was fury layered in grief. I was every unanswered prayer my mother ever whispered into her wine glass. I was every missed birthday, every empty chair, every Christmas solo left unsung. But more than that, I was tired. Tired of pretending that Caleb had simply vanished. Tired of watching this town polish its windows while letting rot seep through the floorboards. The police questioned me again. They wanted the original tape. I gave them a copy. They asked how it came to me. I told them the truth. I didn't know. I checked the postmark. It had been mailed from Augusta 2 days after Thomas Kennelly's death. No fingerprints on the envelope. No surveillance footage at the drop-off box. A perfect ghost trail. But someone out there had heard his last confession, and someone had decided I needed to hear it too. I kept digging. I requested church records through a legal contact, used every ounce of pressure I had. I wasn't a journalist. I wasn't a lawyer. I was just a sister. But sometimes grief is the best credential you have, and I found it, buried in a scanned personnel roster from 1993. A single line. Brother Thomas Kennelly. Facilities oversight and disciplinary support. Disciplinary support. The words chilled me. He hadn't just cleaned floors, he had access to the children. He had authority. And then there was another name, 3 lines below. Father Matthias DuPont, parish director, still listed, still active until his retirement in 2015. Moved to a care facility in Ohio. No charges. No public mention of misconduct. He got to age in peace while my brother lay silent behind the very wall that echoed with his name every Sunday. I drove to Ohio the following week. Didn't tell anyone. Didn't ask for permission. The facility was quiet. Red brick, trimmed hedges, wind chimes hanging from the porch. The nurse at the desk raised her eyebrows when I asked for Matthias. I told her I was an old parishioner, that I had memories to settle. She smiled too politely and waved me in. He was in a corner room, small, simple, a crucifix above the bed, a chair by the window. And there he was, old, shriveled, a man whose voice once filled cathedrals, now reduced to whispers and murmurs into his tea. When he looked up and saw me, something flickered in his eyes. Not recognition, but calculation. I know why you're here, he said. I sat down. I doubt you do, I replied. He didn't deny it, didn't ask who I was, just stared out the window, where wind bent the trees into half prayers. I didn't kill your brother, he said finally. No, I said. You just buried him. He swallowed hard. I protected the church. No, you protected yourself. He didn't speak for a long while. Then, in a voice almost too soft to hear, he said, I thought I could carry it. Thought if I prayed hard enough, fasted long enough, God would understand. And did he? Matthias turned his face toward me then, and for the first time, I saw something like sorrow. No, he said. He didn't. I stood up. I don't need your apology, I told him. I don't need your penance, but I need you to know, you didn't just bury Caleb. You buried every version of me that could have existed with him alive. Every laugh, every fight, every terrible harmony we might have sung. You stole all of it. He didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't bless me. He just looked down at his hands and said nothing. And that silence was the closest thing to justice I would ever get from him. As I walked out of that care home, I didn't feel lighter, but I felt honest. And sometimes, that's more powerful than peace. Because a lie can only hold its weight for so long, until someone dares to carry the truth all the way to the end. The next Sunday, I did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I went to Mass, not out of faith or hope or any belief that the God behind that altar still wanted to hear from me. I went because Caleb had once stood in this church, lifted his voice beneath its arched ceiling, and poured something pure into a space that had never deserved it. I went to reclaim that sound, to make sure it didn't vanish with him. St. Jude's looked the same. The pews still gleamed with soft polish. The air still held that sacred weight, like every breath was being measured. But there were no echoes anymore. That was the thing I noticed first. Even the voices singing hymns sounded cautious, as if the building itself was waiting to be forgiven. I sat alone, 3 rows from the back. The choir began to sing. New faces, new robes, same sheet music. But there was no soprano like Caleb. No clarity, just trembling voices carried by guilt. During the homily, Father Brandt spoke gently about truth, about how it sometimes arrives in forms we don't expect. He never said Caleb's name, never said the word murder, but everyone in that room knew why their throats were tight and why their hands stayed still during the final hymn. After communion, a girl about 11 years old approached the pulpit. She was small, with dark braids and wide, serious eyes. She unfolded a piece of paper. My name is Elise, she began. I sing in the choir now. My mom told me about Caleb Morgan. She said he used to sing here too. I didn't know him, but I think I know what it's like to love singing more than anything. So, this is for him. She stepped away from the microphone and without accompaniment began to sing Ave Maria. She sang it in Latin, notes quivering, rising, catching the ceiling like a breath long held. And for a moment, I didn't see the church. I saw Caleb, barefoot on the stage during practice, standing too straight for a boy his age, hitting the high note and looking so surprised, like he couldn't believe it had come from him. The girl's voice cracked near the end. She closed her eyes and held the final note anyway. It didn't need to be perfect. It was honest. And for the first time since the wall was opened, I cried, not from grief, but from recognition, because the music had returned. After Mass, I stepped outside into the cold December sun, still clutching the program like it meant something more than liturgy. A woman caught my eye in the parking lot, middle-aged, kind eyes. She approached slowly. "You're Caleb's sister, right?" she asked. I nodded. She hesitated, then said, I knew him, just a little. I was a few grades ahead, but he once gave me his extra cookie at choir retreat because I forgot my lunch. I never forgot that. I smiled. It was the smallest memory, but it was something real, something I hadn't known. Later that week, others came forward. Old classmates, choir members, a teacher, a retired officer. Each had a fragment of Caleb, of that night, of the way the parish handled the aftermath. Most hadn't spoken about it in years. Some hadn't ever. But like wind slipping through an old house, truth was finding its way in through the cracks. I collected these fragments like they were bones. Not to rebuild him, nothing could do that, but to remember him fully, not just as the boy who vanished, but as the boy who was. The boy who loved chocolate milk, who hummed when he did math homework, who once cried when his voice cracked for the first time, who smiled, wide and toothy, when I surprised him with a new notebook for his music. He wasn't just a victim. He was Caleb. And now, the town couldn't pretend not to know him anymore. They couldn't unhear the confession. They couldn't unfind the wall, and I couldn't unknow the girl he might have become had his voice been allowed to grow. One afternoon, I visited his grave. For the first time, there was something to visit. A proper headstone, a date, a name. Caleb Benjamin Morgan, 1980-1993. His voice still echoes. I placed a small recorder beneath the flowers. Not the tape. The tape stayed with me, but something new. Elise had agreed to record her version of Ave Maria, said she wanted it to live there with him, and so it does. Now, when the wind moves right and the day is quiet, that grave doesn't feel empty anymore. It hums. And I finally understand. Silence was never the enemy. It was just waiting for the right voice to break it. I didn't open the envelope for weeks. Not the original one. The one with the confession tape. After everything that unfolded, after the wall came down, after the forensics, the church statements, the whispers in town, I kept that envelope sealed in a drawer next to Caleb's old piano books. I think part of me was afraid that if I touched it again, it would all unravel, that the grief would start over, that maybe some part of me would go back to being 16, sitting by the phone, waiting for a call that never came. But one morning in late January, with snow piled against the porch and the world hushed in white, I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and unsealed the flap. There was only one thing inside besides the tape, a short handwritten note. No name, no address, just 3 lines. I held this for too long. He was gentle. He didn't fight. I don't expect forgiveness, just release. I stared at the words until they stopped swimming. I imagined the hand that wrote them, trembling, old, ink smudged. Maybe Thomas wrote them himself before he died, or maybe someone else, someone who loved him enough to carry the weight of his last words forward. Either way, they had chosen me, not the police, not the church. Me. I pressed play on the tape again. I didn't need to. I'd memorized every syllable, but I wanted to hear his voice in the quiet. I didn't mean to hurt him, I swear. It was just supposed to be a warning. He was going to tell someone about Father Matthias, about the things that happened during practice. I panicked, pushed too hard. He fell, hit his head, and then he didn't move. There was a long pause on the tape, then a ragged breath. Matthias told me we had to protect the parish, that no one would believe a boy like him, that if we buried him, God would understand, that we could repent together. I could hear the shake in his voice when he said Caleb's name. He was only 13. He sang like a bird. I still hear him sometimes. When I mop the floors, when I lock up after midnight, I hear him in the walls. Then static and silence. I didn't cry this time. I didn't scream. I simply sat there, letting the truth pass through me like wind through open windows. Because the truth doesn't always come to punish. Sometimes it comes to release. And I felt it. Something I hadn't felt in 30 years. Air, space. The room inside me that had been shut tight since the winter of 1993 finally opened. In the weeks that followed, I made copies of the tape, sent one to the local library archive, one to the Maine Innocence Coalition, and one to Elise, the girl from the choir. I think he would have liked your voice, I wrote. She wrote back a week later. He sings with me now, and I believed her, because Caleb isn't just a case anymore. He isn't a mystery, or a headline, or a name whispered in caution. He's a sound, a vibration, a presence. Every time the wind moves through pine trees, every time an old hymn is sung with trembling voice, every time someone dares to tell the truth, even when it shakes them, he's there. Sometimes, at night, I sit on the porch with the tape in my lap and whisper things I never got to say. Things like, "I'm sorry I didn't walk you home. You would have made a beautiful music teacher. I still have your notebook." And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I swear I hear him answer, not in words, but in song. A single note, clear, high, unbroken. Because some voices aren't meant to fade. They're meant to return again and again, until someone finally hears them. Until silence becomes memory, and memory becomes truth, and truth becomes the beginning of something whole. Thank you for listening.